Hi, welcome to the Newberry Chronicles. I'm Michael,
And this is Rebecca.
and this is a podcast where two readers go through the Newberry medals and give our thoughts on each one, the Newberry Medal winners, I should say. And so this time we are going to be talking about the very first Newberry Medal winner, which was, I think, published in 1921, but then the medal was given in 1922. That's correct?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. And this book, The Story of Mankind, is written by a man named Hendrik Wilhelm von Loon. And I'm only saying von Loon because, Rebecca, you found out.
That the Dutch pronunciation is Van Loon, but the English pronunciation is Van Loon, and he said it didn't matter very much to him whatever way you pronounce it.
Well, it matters to me. We on the
Yes.
Newberry Chronicles value our rigor in fact-checking and pronunciation. And so if you guys heard me or somebody else allegedly mispronouncing this man's name in the previous podcast, we issue an apology for anyone who may have been offended. Anyway, I'm going to give a quick overview of what this book is, and then we can talk about it. So, The Story of Mankind is a book that is exactly what its title says. It is. It's the story of mankind, starting with the dawn of humanity, all the way up through. Well, he initially stopped writing in 1921, and so up through World War I. The version we have was published in 1984, and so they added, he added one section in the 1920s, and then his grandson added more sections to cover up through the middle of the century, and then another academic has added chapters to bring us up to 1984. There's another more recent edition that covers up through 2010. But yeah, this is a nonfiction book, one of the very few Newberry Medal winners that's nonfiction, I believe. And it is also, I think I'm confident in saying this will be the longest Newberry Medal winner that we will read, because it is...
I definitely hope so.
Yeah, it is 592 pages, and granted, that's the 1984 version, but the 1922 or 1921 version is only about 100 pages shorter than that, which butts it right up to about 500 pages, which is really long, and it's not big type either, especially for a kid's book. And it's fairly dense. You know, he's got to cover thousands of years of history, and I mean, he could have made this a lot longer, as he reminds us many times. And for that, Mr. Von Loon, I think that you didn't make it any longer. So one thing I should add, though, is it's not really the story of mankind. I think that Von Loon thinks it is as much as he can within his space limitations, but really it's mostly the history of Western Europe. We get, in the early goings, stuff about ancient Egypt, we get stuff about Persia and Babylon and all that sort of stuff, but really only because those eventually feed into Greece and Rome, which, of course, like in the modern sense, are the kind of like birth of Western civilization, whether rightly or wrongly people consider it that. So most of this is about Western Europe. We don't even get a lot of stuff about like Czechoslovakia or what the Slavic regions. And he's pretty clear about that by the end. He talks about how I only had so much space, and so I picked the things that I thought were most relevant to the development of mankind. But because I'm my particular background gives me particular biases, and someone who is writing this in a different part of the world would probably write something different. And I would say that's definitely the case. If you're writing this in Africa, you may have mentioned Africa a few more times than just ancient Egypt and the colonial exploits. If you were Chinese, you probably would have talked about almost anything about China besides, again, the colonial exploits with China and all that. So it's fairly limited in terms of the entire scope of human experience. It talks a lot about Western Europe, though, and so it might be worthwhile it's probably worthwhile just taking it on those terms rather than complaining that they don't talk about, the Indian subcontinent very much or something like that. But yeah, speaking of Mr. Von Loon, and his biases. So as we've already talked about, he was born in 1882. He emigrated from the Netherlands in 1902 to study at Harvard and Cornell. So this dude's like a academically trained historian. He was a journalist as well, working for the Associated Press. He worked during the Russian Revolution and like a European correspondent during World War I as well. He also wrote a lot of different young adult books. This was the one that got him the gold, though, the Newbery Gold.
And he was known for his illustrations, but I don't really know why, if his illustrations are anything like they are in this book. That's just a personal
These
opinion.
are his illustrations. They credit him.
Right, but I'm saying I don't really know why he was recognized for them, because I don't think that they're anything to write home about.
They're
but
very sketchy.
We're
They're
gonna get to our opinions in a bit, but that's just
Yeah.
the one thing I wanted to add right now.
Also, credit where credit is due before we are more critical of this dude. The Nazis did not like this dude. And in fact, when the Nazis party took power, he was banned from Germany. And he helped in FDR's political campaigns as well. So, if we ever seem too negative, let us be clear that any one person's life is a multitude of complicated interlacing threads, and not all of them are negative. So there's some good things about Mr. Van Loan. So that's the book. That's the man whose very subjective perspective we are going to be talking about today. So why don't we start with the things that we like, Rebecca?
Yeah, I think it's always important to start with the positive in these books. And I will say this analysis is going to be different than the other books that we read, just because it's a different type of book. I think while these pages are very, very long, it would not be helpful to our listeners, I think, to go in depth about the plot, as there is no plot. It is just history, which is a plot in and of itself. But regardless, what we liked, I do appreciate that Van Loan is both very pro-science throughout the book and is pro the arts, neither of which seem to be very popular these days.
Yeah, I will say he takes some pot shots at William Jennings Bryan, which is very funny.
Yes.
We were just down the road, about 100 miles away from Bryan College and Dayton, Tennessee, where the famous monkey trials happened, which are a lot more complicated than their historical legacy. But he's basically a progressive, not in the modern sense of progressive, but in the progressive in the sense of he is for the things that advance the progress of human knowledge, basically.
Yeah, and so one thing that he said about the arts, which I thought was really poignant, and it's also not a surprise because this guy is an author. But as he's talking about the story of mankind, he talks about once mankind has the time for leisure, that's when the arts really come to flourish. And he does have this quote that I think is kind of beautiful. He says that a world without art and happiness resembles a nursery without laughter. And so that's something that I think you can really see play throughout the book as he's talking about human triumphs and human setbacks, is really valuing the arts and what they mean to mankind. So I thought that was beautiful. I know I just was criticizing his illustrations, but I also appreciate them in this book, not because I think they're good, but I think they make the book go quicker. Which, when you have almost 600 pages to read, I think that is very nice. I also, for what it's worth, this book does not read as a traditional history book, so it flows pretty well. He tries to kind of weave the story. Obviously, it's a story of mankind, but I think he does a good job of not just giving, here's one fact, here's another, and here's another. But I think he tries to show how those build off of one another and influence the next decisions that were to come. And I think overall he does that really well. I also appreciate, for what it's worth, the chapters are fairly short, so that helps.
That's
I mean,
always like the
I
backhanded
just,
compliment of
I'm really
books.
sorry, but the mechanics of it, I think, work well for what it is. Um, but yeah, that's what I liked. What did you like, Michael?
um, I do agree that it's got a good flow. It does a good job of painting history as a series of like interlocking events which have effects on one another rather than the simple memorization, like, timeline of dates and stuff. I think, uh, well, that's a negative. I'll wait until later. I also like, okay, this annoyed Rebecca, and I think that this is a double edged sword. But he has a very colorful voice for the kind of book he's writing, right? I mean, this isn't like, whatever, like a Mark Twain book or something where it's very sardonic and stuff. But he editorializes quite a bit, and sometimes in ways that are very funny. Toward the end of the book, he has a chapter which I don't know why he didn't put it at the beginning of the book, because it basically gives his methodology, which is like, I'm trying to give the history, not of everything that happened, but of the things that I think most contributed to, like I say, he's a progressive, the progress of like the development of he says mankind. I think it's mostly Western Europe again.
Well, I think the reason why he didn't do that at the beginning is because he didn't ask for feedback till I think he was almost done.
Yeah, so this the funny thing about this chapter is that he talks about how he's discouraged about how the progress of this book is going, and he wishes he could start over, but his publisher won't let him and stuff. And there's little asides like that throughout the book where he's like, I really wish I could talk about this, but I gotta keep going. Or like some of the stuff, and this is like, again, the part that's the double-edged sword. He editorializes a lot, like, about how he characterizes, like, he'll characterize whole people groups with these dismissive, like, series of adjectives, like. The one that stands out to me the most is the Phoenicians. And there's a whole chapter about the Phoenicians and their connection with the Mediterranean trade, at the end of the Bronze Age and all that sort of stuff. And he talks about how the Phoenicians they had no moral code, and all their neighbors said so, and they didn't have any friends, and all that sort of stuff.
And then he also says later on, though, that when you're telling history, that you can't share your opinions. You're just supposed to share facts. So I don't really know what he thinks he's doing.
But at times it's very like, this book is not like a laugh riot, but at times it is very amusing, some of the ways that he words things, because it is a really invasive authorial voice compared to, let's say, like a more traditional non-fictional textbook, or something like that, because his opinions are very clear. Again, like I said, double-edged sword, but like, as someone who is like, when he was writing this, I assume he was very familiar with the Russian Revolution, since I guess he was covering that. But he makes little asides, like when he's talking about like the rise of like Karl Marx and communism and socialism in the 1800s, and he's like, I won't use the word bourgeoisie because that I've just become tired of that word, and so I'll just say capitalists and things like that. It's funny, like,
Yeah.
it doesn't always make for good history, but it's occasionally very funny.
And he stops every once in a while to talk to his grandchildren, because that's who he wrote this book for. So he does take on a very grandfatherly tone that I think is cute. I know I said I was annoyed, but mostly it's because I hate it when people try to justify why they're talking so long or writing so long about something, and in doing that, they write even longer than they would have otherwise. I'm just like, just go for it.
You would hate Don Quixote, which is what I'm reading for leisure right now.
I would hate
which
it.
Which makes a point of doing that. But anyway, let's get into what we didn't like, because I think this is going to be
as we've already started.
We're naturally segueing into this. I think this is going to be the meat of the podcast. So, Rebecca, you begin.
Well, I mean, this is not surprising. Both of us, when we looked at this book and said, well, this is a history book that was written in the 1920s for children by a white man, I think we had our assumptions going in about what this book was going to be. And most of those assumptions were true, I think.
I would say so. I mean, in terms of, okay, and this is meant as a value neutral statement, but like, I think that he basically represents fairly consistently what, like, kind of like the American liberal consensus of the world would have been in like the early 1900s. And like specifically liberal, like as opposed to, let's say, communist, which was also a big deal in America at the time. Also specifically as opposed to, let's say, like reactionary or conservative, right? Like he is not. He's basically trying to make like the nice guy. Like he wants people to be nice. He doesn't seem to really value oppression in and of itself, or try to when he does talk about oppression, he either one tries to make it clear that like it was nice and so don't worry about it, or two, make it clear that it was wrong, right? He's not trying to say, for instance, that slavery was good, which is what a lot of people were saying in the 1920s, actually.
That's true.
So I think that like he's if so anyway, like I said, that's a value neutral statement, but I think reflects where his perspective is.
Yeah.
Like he's not a KKK guy, which is
he's not
foregone conclusion for the 1920s.
He is not. But just to give some examples, this book I think is very racist.
It is. I agree. I'm not really defending it.
Yeah. One is that Asian people are called yellow throughout the book, and that's just pretty normalized. Like it's not even phrased as kind of an insult. You can just tell that these things were just how academic, maybe not all academics, but it was fairly acceptable for people to just talk about other races in this way.
It's hard to tell too, because language is funny in that sometimes things that were once considered neutral have become offensive because they've been associated with things. So to be honest, I don't know how offensive calling someone yellow would have been, but he's clearly very pejorative toward Asians.
And he's very dismissive of other cultures, which I'll get to, but blacks are depicted as uncivilized, they're uneducated, they're just depicted as inferior. And some examples of this is he's very dismissive of just even the concept that royalty existed in African countries. So when he talks about kings, he makes up this funny name for like a made up name for a king that you can tell is just kind of criticizing cultural norms in these African countries. And he makes a point to say this is nothing like the kings that you and I think about.
Which is funny because so much of this book, because of the history of Europe, is all these petty squabblings between like various like low level like monarchs and stuff, like just like squabbling with one another. And were this happening in Africa or something, I think we would be fairly comfortable in saying these are tribal disputes. But since it's happening in the context of Europe, we say, oh, this is the king of Northumbria, or whatever, and we talk about that in a way that glorifies it, even though like in terms of the scale of conflict happening, it's not that different than what I'm using we to indicate like maybe generic European descendant folks who don't know that much about Africa. We would pejorize as like merely tribal.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's the problem throughout the book. It's just that the era of white supremacy, which again is not surprising with when it was written and who wrote it. And one thing I forgot to say that I liked is I do think there is an air of humility with Van Loan. Like he's able to say, if you read other history books, which you should, you're going to get a different perspective. You're going to get different biases here.
He repeatedly refers people to his bibliography at the end of the book, which is impressive for something for children.
I really do. I really do think that is good. And like I said, I don't feel that many people are saying that today in terms of education, what we're teaching our kids, what teachers should be teaching. So I really do appreciate him for that. So as much as I criticize him, I do think he has some self-awareness about just self-awareness, but also the importance of like hearing different perspectives, which I really appreciate. Some other things that are questionable, and again, I'm critiquing the things that I know now, like have really shaped the way that we've taught our American history. So there's a lot more in this book than America. America is not the main part, but
it's actually a very small.
It is, but those are the things that I'm reading it, and I'm like, well, you definitely got that wrong. That's my bias there. But I do. He barely talks about Native Americans. He does make a statement about how Native Americans died under slavery, but Black people were stronger, and thus they could work in under harsher conditions. So
Which is
that
very untrue, by the
it
way.
is,
Like,
and also it's so sad reading this because you see ways in which not this book necessarily, but these kind of ideas still have weight today. Like when you think about our, you know, I don't want to get on too many soapboxes, but when you just think about what we've taught throughout history, what we've learned throughout our history in school, and also what we've understood in terms of medical care for minorities, it just made me very sad because you could tell that these ideas were just um, accepted as fact, and it's just really concerning how many people were hurt by these things. So that just made me sad as I was reading it. But did you have another
yeah.
comment on that?
Well, I mean, it's part of that thing that I says is a double edged sword because about his authorial voice, which is that he will characterize people groups as having certain characteristics, and this isn't characteristics like they come from this part of the world or whatever. It's like either physical or personality traits, and I think that we nowadays, especially having seen like. I mean, 1920s is the height of like quote unquote like scientific racism, right? Where the idea was like to isolate like what are the inherent traits of people of different races or whatever. And I think now, if we're not altogether like dismissive of the idea of biological race, we at least understand that um, most of these things are socially conditioned rather than something inherent in them. But like for instance, with the Native American stuff, him talking about how Native Americans just weren't strong enough to work in the fields on plantations and stuff, and so they just died.
Mm-hmm.
And
They laid down and died. It was as if it was just a choice that they made.
yeah, and so like on one hand, that's kind of like a funny way to describe that, but also it's not true because if you look into the history of it, at least as I understand it, which like again biases, like the thing that made Native Americans difficult to uh, put into chattel slavery was that people were like Native Americans are of course native to the lands in which they were trying to be enslaved, and so they were much more adept at escaping. They also had their people groups there to liberate them and all that sort of stuff. Whereas with African slaves, you have kidnapped them, taken them away from their support systems,
Mm-hmm.
put them into conditions and regions that they're not familiar with, like. And so all of that is based on their conditions and setting. That's why that happened. But he describes that element of history of why we enslaved Africans as opposed to Indians as a feature of their immutable characteristics. And he does that a lot in the
Yeah.
book.
And so, like I said, none of that is surprising, but it just made me really sad. Um, just thinking about where we are in America. And also, Michael and I recently read, I say recently, we were reading it last year, but we recently read Kendi Stamp from the Beginning, which is a better book than this one. Also, more worth your time
It's also much narrower in
than this
scope.
one. That is true. That is true. But again, that's just I don't have anything. I have other things to critique about the history that I'm not as familiar with, but this was just more personal, I guess. So I'll finish up. The other thing I would just say is this book is just boring. I mean, as you would anticipate a book of the story of mankind to be, I do appreciate his undertaking. I was concerned for him that he, spent so much time in doing this, but I appreciate the undertaking, and apparently others did as well because he won the Newbery Medal. So, any other dislikes that you would add?
I mean, we could go through like, historical beat by historical beat and like it's one of these things where I don't know about everything.
Mm-hmm.
I can't claim that, for instance, I am an expert on the transition from feudalism into mercantilism and then capitalism in Europe, right? Which he spends quite a bit of time talking about because that's a really important shift. But I don't know the details of that as well as I know the details of, let's say, whatever, ancient Greece or the early 20th century or something like that. I mean, and so, but so I could go through and like for the stuff I know, like critique stuff. But I think like overall, like I agree. It's boring. I don't know how you could make a book like this not boring because it is. It's like trying to cram so much information into your head all at once. Like reading a book that's like this is the entire history of the world. And I don't know if there's a way to make that engaging. But we're also probably reading it in the wrong way because we're
Right.
trying to read it over the course of a couple weeks. Maybe this would be better as like, oh, we're gonna read one chapter
Yeah.
every week, as part of a school curriculum or something. Although I wouldn't recommend this being part of a school
No.
curriculum for the reasons that we've already stated that it's not amazing history. I also think like one thing that again the scope of this book makes it impossible to actually do this well is that when he's talking about like, oh, I only picked the stuff that I thought was important to the development of the world and leaves out most of Asian history and most of African history. Well, in the 20th century, Asian and African history becomes central to world
Yeah.
politics. As well as Latin American history and South American, like all that, like
Which
Central and South America, like. And so what happens is in the sections that he didn't write, where the people are trying to bring it up to the 1980s, they're having to backtrack and cover all this
Yeah.
stuff with China, all this stuff, especially with like Central and South America, and I mean, it just goes to show that like your biases with history are going to create real blind spots so that you can't anticipate what is important. And I think specifically the way that he talks about colonialism, but he only talks about colonialism in respects to how it affected what was happening in Europe, which was
Yeah.
like conflicts between those nation states, like between France and Spain like the Netherlands and stuff like that. Like he doesn't really talk about the effects on like the people in those countries, except to like kind of do a hand wavy sort of thing, like oh, but the Europeans brought education and all the modern medicine and all that, so it's okay. And I mean that's its own problem is the way that he kind of is dismissive of some really awful stuff with colonialism. But a big problem is that if you had read this in the 1920s and then all of a sudden had to deal with Indian liberation and all of the liberations of the African nations and then the Vietnam War and all this sort of stuff, you would be so ill-equipped to understand what was happening because all of those things are not just about how those European nations took resources from those countries to enrich themselves, which he talks about, but they're also specifically about the impact of that practice on those countries. And like, understanding the Vietnam War, one of the most, or the Korean War, two of the most like important conflicts of, the post World War II, world. There's no way to understand the lead up to those things, much less, let's say, the Middle East, which again, like everything that happens, like with World War I, stuff like that, is so important to understanding like what ends up happening with the Middle East in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But you wouldn't know that from having read this book, and you can't criticize this guy for not knowing the future.
True.
And this book shouldn't have been any longer. It was already mighty long. That said,
That is true.
like I don't know. Maybe he's just doomed. Maybe he's just got this like this project itself is just an albatross around his neck that he can never do. He could never do to the satisfaction.
Yeah,
of
and that's
what we are.
That's one thing I've been thinking about a lot as I'm frustrated with him, but also like appreciating what he's trying to do. I mean, I definitely would never do something like this. But I don't know that you can write a story of mankind because when you attempt to do so in the way that he has, you're going to be speaking from the perspective of those that were in power and why those that had agency, why they made the decisions that they made. But that's the story of the elite. That's not the story of every man, every woman. And I
think that's it's a shorthand that a lot of people have
Yeah.
to take because it's really difficult to talk about the millions of people living in Europe. It's a lot easier to talk about like the few dozen monarchs that
Yeah.
existed at a certain time in Europe, and that's still really hard to do. But yeah, he does, to his credit, he's not, he does talk a lot about like especially once you get into the industrialized part, like what like everyday life was like as like Europe industrializes, and he talks about like the rise of trade unions
Yeah.
and socialism and a lot of stuff that purports to represent like the perspective of like the quote unquote common man, right? And so he gives time to those things for sure, but but not nearly as much time as like let's say to Napoleon, which I mean obviously Napoleon's important, but man, we hear a lot about Napoleon.
The other thing that I would say that I appreciated and was surprised by was his acknowledgement of what the Industrial Revolution has done to the environment and what it's going to continue to do. Like he talks about that, and I mean we're living that now,
True.
and we're still having these conversations. With I don't feel I just appreciated the authority with which he spoke about that. But then, there's other things that he speaks with authority on that I just disagree with him. So I think, again, that's just where I'm like, yeah, I wish more people were saying this now. But I don't know if you were also surprised by that, but I was surprised by that in the book.
I don't know. It's hard to be surprised or not surprised because this book covers such a breadth of topics that you never know what he's going to cover next.
Yeah.
And okay, we have a chapter on environmentalism. Like, okay, I guess like we talked about everything else. But yeah, I don't know. So again, like I said at the beginning, like this guy, as with everybody, it's just a complex. Everybody is complex and everybody's perspective is complex, and so like part of what we're just ripping into is we simply disagree with his perspective because we are not progressive liberals from the 1920s, and were we that, we probably would have much different things to say about this book, and so and I'm sure if we decided to tell the story of mankind, people would feel the same way about us, and so like as with anybody, like it's just a bundle of irreconcilable tensions that are manifested in the way that they understand the world, and that's what this book represents, I think.
Yeah.
Which is it's interesting as an artifact. I will say this: we were talking to a friend of ours earlier today, and he made this point, which he hasn't read it. He just listened to us talk about this book, and he was like, "Well, it sounds kind of interesting as like just a fossil of what people thought about certain things at a certain point in time," and it is. Does that mean it's worthwhile to read to children in 2022? Does that mean it's worth your time in 2022 in anything but like an academic sense? Like, I would say not. I wouldn't recommend. Well, I guess we can get to the thumbs up and thumbs down in a second, but
yeah, I just wanted to make one other point that you're just moving away from what we liked and what we disliked. As I was in the trenches of reading this book, and I'm like, were there really no better books written or published in 1921? I looked up other books that were published in that year. And funny aside, I forgot to tell you this, Michael, but there were 2 books. They were not published in America, so they wouldn't be eligible for the Newbery. But Ellen Montgomery wrote one of the Ingleside books, like continuing the Anne of Green Gables stories that year.
Really?
Yeah, and then there was an Oz book that was published that year.
Yeah, so, he was publishing Oz books all over the 1920s.
And those were sequels and stuff like that, but there were other things being written. But one thing that I came across that was published in America was a book called American Indian Stories that was published the same year as Story of Mankind and would have been eligible for the Newbery. And this is written from the perspective, it's written by a Sioux Indian talking about the hardships that were encountered in the Native American missionary and manual labor schools. And it was very much advocating rights for Native Americans, calling for a greater understanding of Native American cultures. So I thought that was really meaningful, that while this history was written from this very biased perspective and kind of dismissive of minorities and their history and how they play a role in the story of mankind, there was this book that was written that I think sounds way more interesting than this. So maybe we'll read that someday. But
you know what Hendrik Wilhelm von Loon would probably say? he would be like, well, good, go read that book. It's good to get a variety
He
of
would.
perspectives.
He would, which, again, that is to his credit. But
What I would say is don't read this book. Find histories of little bits of history, such as the Sioux Indian experience or whatever. Don't again, like I think talking about this has made me call into question the premise of this book in itself. And the way to learn history is not through this like huge big picture, approach to like thousands of years of history and like a few hundred pages. It's the importance of understanding what the perspectives are and saying I'm going to dive into those perspectives rather than try to have a comprehensive, conclusive history. And I mean, like obviously, as far as like textbooks and that sort of like thing go, there is value in that. But in terms of sitting down and reading a book cover to cover, thumbs down, I say, on this book.
I wholeheartedly agree. But I am very excited to introduce our next book that we're going to be
shaking off the dust.
Yes,
from our heels.
Which, ironically, you started out this podcast saying that we think that this is one of the very few nonfiction books that won the Newbery, but the next one we're reading is also a nonfiction book. It's actually a biography of my homegirl, Louisa May Alcott. It's called Invincible Louisa, and it's written by Cornelia Meeks. I don't remember off the top of my head what year it was published, but it was in the 1930s because that's the decade we're going to next.
Right, just as a reminder in case you've not been studiously taking notes, listeners, but our process is going to be we're going to pick one book from each decade and then we'll wrap back around. So we did the 1920s with Story of Mankind, now we're doing the 1930s with Invincible Louisa, and then after that it'll be the 40s, 50s, etc. So
yeah. So thanks for listening to us barely talk about what we liked about this book.
Because it's not a good book.
It's not. But I also, we've talked enough about it. So join us next time.
Yes, for probably a more positive conversation. I hope it's a more positive conversation or else you're going to be very disappointed. Don't do Louisa wrong.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.